Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Industry Pro webinar. My name is Alex Freeman. I am the regional sales manager here at BroadwayWorld.com, and I'm excited to have you with us today. Today, we're going to talk about a digital strategy in this complex moment that we find ourselves in as an industry. And so to do that, we'll be joined by Ryan Greer, Cher Nobles, and Robert Jones from AKA NYC to talk about that. But first, I want to just remind you about a couple of things that we've got going here at Broadway World. We have this Industry Pro section. We've got weekly webinars. If you've stumbled on this webinar, you're probably aware of the Industry Pro section. We're also doing a lot of audience research through that section and finding different ways to connect the industry. So we want to keep working with all of you to make those connections continue on. If you've got insights to share or any other information that you want to see from us, ideas, all those things, feel free to email me, afreeman@broadwayworld.com. I want to update us before we get into this conversation on a few different pieces of information. We sent out a new round of our audience survey in June, and that garnered some really interesting results as we compare it to May. I do apologize for some technical difficulties on my end, which is why we are not showing some charts right now, but I will talk you through some of this data, and then I will email out all of the charts to everybody after the presentation today. So the first thing I want to note is that one of the questions we asked is, have you paid for a stream? In May, we saw 65% of the full audience set respond with no, and 35% respond with yes. As we've gone into June, that number has increased to 40% of the audience has paid for a stream. That's from the full data set of visitors. And I think that shows us a couple of things. One, it shows us some improved programming from those that are offering streams. It also offers that probably more companies have entered the streaming sphere with different options and programming. And I think we're also seeing the success of the pay what you can model. So a lot of companies have gone and offered the stream is technically free, but asking for a pay what you can donation. And I think that they're starting to see more and more people respond in that way in their giving. I also think that part of it is what we are seeing across the broader economy is that people are beginning to understand that we need to learn to live with the virus in some way. And some of that means seeking out new alternative forms of entertainment. Those that may have said, in March, April, it's probably only a couple more, maybe 2 more months until I can go see a live show. I can go see theater. I can wait. I don't really feel the need to pay to scratch that itch, so to speak. And now people are seeing that, okay, maybe it's going to be more like December or 2021 before I can go sit in a live venue again. And so let me engage with some of those artists and companies that I really, really like. One of the other questions that we asked and was important for us to be tracking was this: how likely are you to see a show in a local/regional theater when theaters reopen if there isn't a vaccine? And that's an important question because many people cite a vaccine as a clear indicator of like, absolutely, I'll feel safe going once we've got that figured out. But with vaccine timelines being what they are, if there is no vaccine, will the audience come, becomes a very important question for us to ask. So in June, this month, what we saw from the full data set is that about 54% of the audiences responded in what I would call a fully positive category, which is very likely, somewhat likely, which is an increase of 8% over what we saw in June. So that's a really strong increase in that regard. And part of that is going to be coming from companies that are doing a better job of telling us what they're doing health and safety wise to improve. And also people, again, learning to kind of live with the virus as they see those things. And so 26% were in the possibly category, with 21% reporting not likely. Those numbers shift a little bit when we compare them to just our site visitors from outside the tri-state area. and that it's a 57% that are in those purely positive categories that I call them, which is an increase of 6% over May, 24% in possibly, and so less than 20%. It's at 17% that say it's not likely that they'll return to the theater in the absence of a vaccine. So those are some really positive numbers that we're seeing. And so I think that what we're seeing, especially for regional houses, is that it acknowledges the sort of phased reopenings that we're starting to see across various states with various effects, and that people are feeling more comfort in smaller crowds, absent vaccines, those companies that may have outdoor programming available, and people wanting to stay local in their leisure plans, that we don't see a lot of people necessarily in the short term looking to hop on a plane to go see something on Broadway or in a major regional house, but want to stay pretty local to their scene, and are discovering that, oh, there's some really great theatrical options right in my own backyard, which is ultimately a good thing for a lot of regional theaters of all sizes. Some other takeaways from the survey data that we sent out both to the Industry Pro group here, which thank you to all of you who have filled out that survey. It was very useful and very eye-opening, a lot of that data. And so what we're seeing is most theaters are starting to plan a December 2020 or a reopening sometime in 2021, with some people still looking at fall dates, but most of them saying, okay, let's plan to reopen for Christmas, or let's see what the health and safety implications of the summer and fall are before we kind of commit to plans. And on a 1-year timeline, we are seeing a majority of audiences planning a trip for pleasure, which is also good to see. Now, on the 6-month timeline, that number is quite depressed, but on a year-long timeline, that means that people's willingness and excitement for travel and for these leisure activities has not necessarily waned. They are just waiting to find a safe moment to start doing that again. And those that are planning a trip in the next year, the vast majority of them report a desire to see a show on that trip. So especially those of you that are working for and with companies that are in some of these tourist destination places, while your audiences may not be coming back this summer and your companies may not be coming back this summer, they are still planning to be there in the long term, which is great to see and to be excited about. So that's sort of the quick rundown on that data. We're going to have a lot more data as we continue to analyze it. There's more and more data every day about what audiences are thinking and where their heads are at, and we want to keep going. And yes, to answer your question there, JC, in the chat, the webinar will be available to view afterwards. We will send out a link as well to the replay, so don't worry about that. But now, after that data dump, I want to bring in Ryan Greer, Cher Nobles, and Robert Jones from AKA NYC. Robert is the head of client service. Ryan is the director of digital strategy and media activation, and Cher is the vice president of business intelligence. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us, Alex. We're honored.
And so, yeah, it's as I was planning out this webinar, and the big question is always, what's the first question? And the first question here almost seems inevitably where to begin with planning a digital strategy in this particular moment. And so to kind of kick things off, I think I want to go to Robert first here, and ask about sort of tone of voice, right? And bringing about, there's so many question marks in the air right now, both health-wise, societally, and so we have these institutions that are sitting in various communities, and may or may not know when they're reopening again. So how does one sort of, with all of these question marks hanging into the air, how does one enter the digital messaging space?
Right. I mean, I think the short answer to it is that we have a social responsibility in all of this. And what I think that means is that we're paying attention to everything that's going on around us. And the reality that I think we've all experienced in these 3 months since this all started is that there is a very big magnifying glass on everything that's happening around us. So, you know, through the virus, through the Black Lives Matter movement, and everything that's to come. So I think the tone of voice, I don't think there's a roadmap that we can sort of say, on July 4th, we're going to do this and celebrate, you know, Independence Day in this way, or Labor Day is going to look like this year, or what does holiday look like? You know, I think plan as we might, and those of us in account services and everybody else on this call, we like to plan, and that's not a luxury we have right now. So I think listening, as we've specifically about the Black Lives Matter movement, is imperative more than ever, and that informs our tone of voice and how we should speak and when we should speak, and also how quickly we should speak, I think, is the most important part of this. Things are happening in real time more than ever, as much as they can. I mean, it's rapid because we're all sitting looking at our screens. So tone of voice is going to evolve. Cher, I think, what do you think about that?
I didn't want to step on your toes, but in insights and research, what we're really trying to do is make sure that our surveys and that our information really is a living, breathing tool and resources. So similar to what you're doing, we are actually doing pulse studies. In addition to how people are feeling about sentiment, we're also trying to make sure that we're in a position to excuse me, I'm sorry, there's some extra sound going on here. Make sure we're in a position to do pulse studies about what's happening in real time with people every few weeks.
Yeah, I think that it's been definitely a challenge in those conversations. I'd love to ask about some of the. Hello, sorry.
I'm so sorry. I think I was muted. I was trying to cut out the background noise. Go ahead.
No. Yeah, I would love to sort of take a look at some of those. So as various data points kind of become available as we go through these things, how should companies, what are some of the data points that companies should be looking at, and how should they sort of utilize those?
Well, I think every company is different and it's really client focused. So it's really more about what are your clients trying to accomplish, and then the questions that you need to ask. We generally sit our insights team and really kind of brainstorm about the types of questions we think people are going to want to know and what they're going to ask, and we're trying to accomplish that in nearly real time. But the important part is to align your business with your data and your surveys and your strategy. And so that you can actually integrate data into every part of your business and integrate that into strategic decisions in real time. In that, given everything that's happening now, 3 to 5 years worth of previous data is not going to be useful to you at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But that's
yeah, and I would add that, like as Robert was saying, we're in a phase of just like planning for every possible scenario right now. So while we're coming up with those plans and like waiting for a moment that we can say this is the moment that we're actually relaunching, we're taking advantage of pixels that are placed on websites. And a lot of institutions have done a really good job about putting out new content and focusing on rehashing old content that they've had, and focusing on messaging to kids and parents, and what they can do to engage people now while they're not open. And what we're trying to do is capture that audience data to see what new audiences are coming to the website to engage with institutions' content, so that we can eventually talk to them, and hopefully we've captured some new audiences that we can tap into eventually.
And I think, just jumping off what Ryan said, is that it's really interesting to see who the people are that are coming to the website during this period of time, how frequently they're coming back, are they purchasing tickets, and how do we talk to them in the future if they are the people that are seeking out what we and other institutions have to offer. That's a pretty valuable audience, I would imagine. The other thing, just going back to the tone part of this and how this relates to who's visiting and when, is that from the institutions that I've worked with around the country, and I know there's a lot of those people on this webinar, I think knowing how to segment your audience and knowing that the tone and the messaging to each audience is probably going to need to be different. Your Broadway subscribers are very different than your one-night concert goers, which are very different than your donors. And making sure that you pay attention to what is happening outside of your four walls and recognizing how different groups of people are going to respond to it and when, and making sure that you're continually engaging them. So the people that are coming to the website during this time, you know, what do you want to say to them? You should talk to them. They should, if they sign up for your newsletter now, make sure that they get your welcome. We don't have tickets to sell right now in many cases, and that's okay, because you should still talk to them even if you're not looking for their dollar.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that is there are really efficient ways to be communicating right now while we're still planning the scenarios for a major relaunch with all the media that we can put back into the market. A lot of our clients are still using social media, both from an organic standpoint and a paid standpoint, to support their organic content, because it's such an efficient way to reach audiences that you have through CRM data, or to prospect new audiences based on lookalike data. Again, as Robert said, I think we live in a time where we have to be sensitive with what social content that we're putting out there, but it's okay to be social right now, and it's such an efficient way to reach people.
Regarding tone, also asking specific questions about what people are looking for or what types of messaging they're looking for. You know, when everyone was first told to go in the house, there's a very different feeling that everyone had as compared to being 3 months in with your children, locked in with anyone for 3 months. You know, the tone becomes very different. And so while we try to look at things as a one slot fits all, the reason why the timing of asking that question and surveying is important is because there's a very big difference between, oh my goodness, we're all going home, and oh no, we've been inside for 3 months now. Tell me something different.
Yeah. And sort of as that, if a company has maybe this was neglecting that conversation aspect to their digital strategy, do you have any tips of how they can sort of now feels like a weird time to be entering into conversation mode, but also an important time to be entering into conversation mode with your audience? How can companies kind of start to make that entry into that conversation space?
I think it's honesty. You know, I think, you acknowledge where you are and what's happening in the world. What we found through our research is that people really need you to be transparent with what your business is doing right now, what it's going to do in the future, how they're going to feel safe in any number of ways. It's not too late. It may be a harder thing to feel authentic because you haven't done that before, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't. In fact, you should.
For my particular take on that question, as well as building personas or building out someone that you can visualize as being a friend in your target audiences or your markets. It's very different to say, we need to send a message to consumers. Well, what do your consumers feel like? What do they look like? Do you give them a name? Do they have certain attributes? So if you're talking to, hypothetically, Jane may be a mom of 2 kids and be between 35 and 54. Her average or median household income is, $80,000. And she really loves green matters and arts and crafts and music. How would you talk to your friend Jane or your friend David? It makes it a much easier task to create messaging for your audience, as opposed to thinking about them as just numbers.
And from my perspective, I think it's important to be really nimble right now, and to listen to the world, and as Robert said, have your honest statement about how your organization feels about the world, because your consumers want to hear that honesty, but don't wait a month or even a week to have that statement. Be really nimble as you can. I know staffs are short right now, but as nimble as you can and flexible, what you can do in the social space and the search space, changing copy and getting your message out there, having a stance as quickly as possible, I think is important.
Kind of following up on that, because staffs in a lot of places are stretched very thin based on for various reasons. For either they were just a small staff to begin with, and there's a lot going on, or there have been at big institutions furloughs. Where, with that in mind, of the very stretched thin staff member, what are some of the key places that they should be focusing some of that energy in this moment?
The first thing I would say is, if the organizations that have grant accounts, they're that free Google money. If you have a grant account, get in there and clean it up as quick as possible. Don't let it go and hope that it's going to be there when you're ready to return to search advertising. It's free money from Google. Get in there. If you have a content hub that you want to direct people to, change the copy. Make sure your copy is linked to what your landing pages you're directing to, so that your quality score goes up and your search is actually relevant. And turn off the transactional copy. If you don't have tickets to sell right now, then turn off your buy tickets now messaging and focus on what you want your consumers to do, whether it's directing to a content page or hopeful about an upcoming season. But I would say step number one would be to clean up your grant account, which, as I said, is free Google money that you can take advantage of.
And from a research standpoint, you want to make sure that your messaging is out there constantly. What they found is that during every recession, the brands that actually continue to advertise actually did 250% better over the 5-year period than people that stopped doing it. And so you really want to make sure that you continue to have a presence, even if you don't have tickets to sell. You want to make sure that your consideration or even just your awareness methods are in place.
And I think in terms of finding your social voice, like we've been talking about, that's really important, and that can't be stressed enough. But I think in terms of looking to the future for the marketers and advertisers, I think knowing the trends, like we've been talking about paying for streaming services and how people are consuming media, and how that may last or how it may change once the world settles into the next phase of what our new normal is going to be after the virus, after a vaccine. People may be driving more and they may be above ground in New York City. So, how often are we going to buy subway advertising, to be very specific about it? TV and print are having a moment again. So I think a lot of us are inclined that that's probably where we're going to be for the foreseeable future. But also, to Ryan's point about being nimble, that could change. I mean, if people have this pent up energy to go back to the arts, and we all of a sudden, once it's safe to do so, I find it hard to believe that it's going to be a huge wave, but maybe it will. If it changes overnight, we've got to be poised to be able to do that.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, very optimistically, phase one in New York, as a New Yorker, happened quicker than I thought it would. So hopefully the phases continue to go really quick, and that, especially with the institutions around the globe and around the nation, things might open up faster. So optimistically hopeful that we do have to be nimble and start playing immediately for a relaunch.
I think with a lot of institutions, look at the ticket sale metric as kind of the way in which they judge a marketing campaign, and sort of how their strategy is going. And so in this age of no tickets to sell, maybe you have streaming things that you're trying to direct people to, maybe you don't, but and some of those may be free or pay what you can. And so sort of that traditional metric, so to speak, of tickets sold is out of the way. So what are some of the metrics that people should be looking at to kind of gauge the success of this messaging?
There are so many ways to answer that, because I don't think that's just true of this time. I think that's true of marketing in general. That like a retargeting campaign, for example, you can retarget the same audience for so long before you've lost that audience. There's nothing else you can say to them. There's nobody else that you're going to be able to convert within that pool. So it's always important, no matter what the time, to have a full funnel marketing plan that's driving more audience members to your website and continuing to refresh your pool so that you have more people to target. I think prospecting, in a sense, is even more important than targeting. With that said, with the full funnel, you have to be looking at what metrics are important to you. There's so many ways to optimize a campaign. Within Facebook alone, I'm just thinking you can optimize towards web traffic or video views or click-through rate. or landing page views, which is like actually not somebody just clicking on your ad, but they've actually landed on your website and they're staying there for a while. So they're potentially a more interested person. So it really depends on what assets you're trying to get out in the world. Obviously, if you're putting a video out, you should look at all the video rates, like whether somebody's watched 10 seconds or what your full completion rate is. But again, I think prospecting and awareness campaigns are very important, especially now when new audiences are available.
I think too, the idea that how there's not one cookie cutter approach to this because every institution is so different and the content on everybody's website and their social channels are all different. So figuring out where your efforts have been and how you specifically want to measure them. You know, is it how long someone's staying on your website? Is it seeing the path of travel they have on their website and where they drop off? How are your newsletter subscriptions? How are you retaining those people? Is there drop off pending, you know, if you send something out and people drop off, why did they drop off? And how to court them when it is time to let them know that you've got some good news. And I think customer service cannot be underestimated too. No doubt so many people listening to this right now have had to deal with tremendous amount of exchanges and refunds and things, and how that customer service experience went. People are going to remember how you make them feel in the end. And hopefully it went well. And if it's not, how do you make it right in this time?
Also, from my perspective, I generally tend to remind people of some research that we found that basically said consumers were starting to respond to how people responded to COVID, how their favorite brands responded to COVID. They also said that they were making changes in their decisions about what they were going to purchase right now and in the future, depending upon those respondents, the responses from brands. And so while you may not have tickets to sell, it is very important for you to have a voice. And if that voice is only awareness or being able to say, this is what we can do to support you being stuck in the house, then those things are the things that need to be shared as well, that everyone has a voice and has something to say. And that even though I agree with Ryan and I agree with Robert, I would say, and on top of that, to just understand the overarching intent as a human being. People like those touch points. People like the fact that you remembered that they were a person in the middle of chaos. And so I would also say, as you're looking at your funnel, as you're looking at your touch points, remember it's important to maintain a voice during this time.
I think that's a really great point, and I want to kind of follow it up with a question for our viewers that are representatives of companies that are primarily roadhouses, that are touring, presenting venues who have sort of a different relationship with the artists that they work with, whereas your regional theaters usually have a roster of talented creatives that they work with regularly and can help put together some of this content for various purposes. And the roadhouses maybe don't have that same kind of relationship. And that's one of the things that we've kind of been hearing from them, is that they wish that they had some of the access to get some of these videos made that other companies are able to put together. And so what are some ideas of how they can kind of enter this conversation? A lot of regional houses can enter the conversation with, like, this is the kind of work that we make. We miss making this work for and with you. But we are here, and we will eventually be back and be ready to go. But some of those sort of presenters who their primary interaction is, here are the tickets to be sold. How do they make that shift?
I think I've worked in New York for a long time, and I've spent some time just recently on the road in Orlando and Boston, and I worked at a presenting house. And I think the organization I worked for in Orlando was the Dr. Phillips Center for the Performing Arts. And I thought it starts with the people that are there, and that organization in particular. We don't call each other colleagues. We call each other colleagues, not coworkers. And our vice president of HR was the vice president of people and culture. So I think if you don't have the artists that are always in your building, you do have a staff, and some of them have staff larger than others. And, what are those people doing in their homes right now? Unfortunately, many of them may not be on staff right now, or they're coming back at a future time. So in what ways can you engage with the shows that were scheduled that may be rescheduled, what's upcoming, what does life at an art center look like right now. Again, going back to the honesty and talking about we are people just as our guests and our customers are people. We're all going through something very in our own personal ways, but we're also going through it as a society. So just listening to what, as Cher was saying, what's Jane, what's David going through? Those people exist in presenting organizations on the staffs. People were going to be traveling to those places. Some tours are being canceled. Let's acknowledge that, and I think knowing that you're allowed to change your message. I know a lot of season announcements happened very early on, and shows that ultimately are not going to be on season rosters this year. People had to pivot, and that's okay as long as you're being upfront and sharing it as soon as you possibly can. It's not lost on any of us that putting together a route for a national tour is a puzzle, and you have to shift things based on the route paths of other national tours. So it takes a minute, but making sure that you can own your voice and your message first is really important. And I think also what's unique about this time is that because staffs are so minimal in many organizations, that the people that are at the top, the leadership, are rolling up their sleeves and they're part of that messaging. And I think that's something that can benefit people moving forward, is that the people that are in charge have actually seen what the messaging for a social post is and what this e-blast copy is going to say. So being part of that process and going through that and having the leadership perspective when you're actually writing copy and doing things on a very micro level, I think it's going to benefit all of us for the long run.
I've loved seeing how the hashtag Only Intermission has evolved over time, which kind of started as a Broadway initiative, but I've seen presenters using it. I've seen regional theaters using it, and it's sort of beautiful. There's no such thing as no content, as Robert's saying. Like, you have some staff right now, you have some people who are passionate about what they're doing still, and they have things to say.
I totally agree with both of you. I also think that setting up some type of guardrails is a little bit helpful, so that people know where the range that they can play in. And it's nice to set up tools for people that if they want a background like we've done for people, or if they want to outline for Instagram, that it's something that the team can use and know that it's already approved. The framework is already approved for them to use. It makes it a lot quicker, faster, easier with the timing to navigate.
And also, too, going back to the idea that shows that we're coming to institutions around the country, there's so much content being generated. I mean, last night, the New York Times had a debut of a series that they're working on. Broadway's Best Shows had their weekly stream of Zoom play readings. I think giving constituents and social followers and other things like that a reason to tune in and to share something that you might think is interesting and you might think is welcome at this time is also something. Include them, make it a party.
And not to sound like a marketer about it, but if you're creating content hubs and you're putting new videos out there, that's again an opportunity to place a pixel, to place some tracking where you can see who these new audiences are that are coming in and engaging with your content, and then reach out to them later when you're able to hopefully, sell tickets to new audience members.
I love that idea, because the idea is as well, most people that love live. And so if you're coming to see content and enjoying content now, really they're waiting for you to open your doors as well, to go back to live. So it's also, I think, important to remind people that digital happens with and in addition to live.
I think that so much great stuff just happened in there. So I'm gonna go back to a couple of pins over the next couple of questions. One of them being the idea that it's okay to change your messaging. I really liked that idea, because I do think that there does come a lot of people are paralyzed with fear of, if I say something and then have to change it later, then my audience, then something's going to happen with my audience, whatever that fear may be. And so I guess my question for those that may be worried about that kind of thing, of announcing something that doesn't come to pass, what do you have to say to that? Like, how often is too often to change your message, if there is such a thing?
I don't think we know the answer to how often is too often. There's an asterisk to everything we say now, right? Because we can get off this call and there could be 5 news headlines that have completely changed our opinions. Who knows? But I think, on one hand, programming is something, I think audiences understand that our industry is a complicated one logistically. And I think, while there might be disappointments, it's programming. I think if you say something that's a message of responding to what's going on in our society, it has to be quick because everything is happening so quickly. It has to be authentic and it has to be responsible and respectful. And I think changing something in that way, let's say there's an oops moment or something is disrespectful or inauthentic, that might be a little bit harder, but still necessary, right? I think making sure that you're paying attention to your tone and looking to everyone around you to sort of, if you have a question, figure out a way to get the answer to it, right? Whether it's asking somebody or, looking what other people are doing. I think making sure that the people that are paying attention feel like you are giving them the best information possible, regardless if it's programming or something that has to do with what's going on in the world.
I love the asterisk mention that you made, Robert. I mean, yeah, we could get off this call and there could be a million headlines that have changed the world. So not only do I think it's okay to change your messaging, I think you have to. I think it's important. I think it's a duty as an organization to have a stance, and as we said, be authentic and be honest and talk to your constituents in a way that they need to hear from you.
I agree with that, but I approach it again from a little more, even though I work with a lot of data, so I'll give that. Like a parent, I think it's important to understand the phrase, when you know better, you'll do better. And so if you've put a message out there that, boy, oh boy, I learned a lot since yesterday, and that's not how I feel today, that it's important to be able to be human enough to say, even though you're an entity, even though you're a brand, I know better today, so I'm going to do better today. And forgive yourself so that you don't paralyze yourself in the moment of, get out the message. Wait a minute. That's one part of it. The second part of it is, do I have a diverse enough opinion group that I feel is giving me an honest answer about what's happening? Because it's one thing to put out a message, but if you put out a message and you really, the group that you're using to mirror yourself with is not as diverse or as educated as you would hope about whatever the issues are, then that needs to be addressed as well. Because if you have a team of diverse people that can actually be their authentic selves and be able to come to you and say, that's not really the message that you want, let's think about how we want to do that. You shouldn't be held up because you're so nervous. You shouldn't be paralyzed to put something out. So I think there's a little bit of nuance within that, is my point.
Mm.
Sorry.
Yeah. So to sort of follow up on the data point and we've talked about audience segmenting a little bit during this, or we've alluded to it. And so I guess the question I want to pose is 2 parts of, one, what kind of data do we want to be using to create those audience segments? And then what are some of the sort of first steps to utilizing those segments in the most effective way possible?
That's a great question. I mean, there are so many ways to boil an egg, right? I mean, a lot of the organizations will have access to their CRM data. So they'll have access to people who have had to have refunded tickets, who are waiting to hear that they're going to be able to get new tickets or that the show's happening again. That's an audience segment that you can create. So if you've got that CRM data, that's something you can upload into social media. That's something you can upload into Google to put out messaging for people to make them aware of when you're coming back or when they can actually use their ticket. For the people that have done a really good job of making content hubs, specifically, like we have one client who's done a really good job of like, here's what we're putting out for kids, here's what we're putting out for adults, here's what we're putting out for our members, really like putting specific pixels on all of those pages to make sure that you're creating a very unique audience, because somebody who's engaging with you who has kids might be very different than somebody who frequents the arts and loves culture and is waiting to see the next best thing. If you put unique pixels on all those pages, you can create unique audience segments, not just of those people visiting, but then you can create lookalike audiences. So people who look like those parents who are coming to your site, people who look like the culture enthusiasts who are coming to your site. So as I said, there's many ways to boil an egg. The possibilities are endless of how you can segment an audience based on CRM data and placing pixels on your site at this time in particular.
I really didn't have that much to say. I was just admiring the conversation. I think that depending on what you're doing, and it depends on the opportunities that you can interact with a client on. So, you know, from surveys and then looking at display, or even if someone has an in-house system, you know, there are other things that we can do to segment, cluster, do decision trees, all type of data science fun work behind the scenes. But I totally agree with what Ryan is saying, Robert.
I agree too. And I think just going back to, you don't have to talk to everybody that you have access to at the same time. And going to what Ryan said, you know, the pixel on every specific piece of content will help you really, really boil down to the people that are going to pay attention to a very specific genre or a very specific message. So you can use that to inform, and you may group family with a concert goer again in the future, or you may group a ballet person with, you know, Billy Joel, if we're talking about, you know, who knows? I think to what Ryan said about the possibilities are endless. It's true.
Well, and the good news with digital is that it's so flexible. So you can experiment with an audience and then start reaching out to them. And if it doesn't work, oh, let's pull that campaign. But look, this parent campaign is working. So let's go after parents with kids who are interested in coming to our organization.
You took the words right out of my mouth. That was the next thing. I encourage testing. And even if you feel like you're not selling, now is also a good time to test. If your message, what messages are working, what creative is working, what's working in which types of audience and which types of segments. Try to maintain and create learning all along the way.
So then my follow-up to that question is, as we start to approach reopenings on who knows what kind of timeline, this could be a year from now, this could be 3 months from now for some companies, 6 months from now, but as companies start to kind of make that transition to consider reopening, what are some of the tactics they may want to employ to start converting some of these new audiences into ticket buyers?
I think Cher alluded to the point that there is going to be a moment when we need to be putting really specific calls to action out, where it's like, buy tickets, please come back to us, we're safe, we're aspirational. But I think Cher was mentioning it earlier, you can't be silent right now. So the things you can be doing right now are looking at your grant account or your paid search account, your paid social account, your organic social account. I think it's important to not be silent now, is sort of my response to that question, as we're gearing up for when we can actually talk to people about tickets. We have one client who smartly negotiated getting the ticket refund data, the CRM data, and we have it uploaded into Facebook. We're ready to act on it, but we haven't done anything yet because there's nothing totally definitive to say to them. So we want to make sure that when we are talking to them, we have a very specific message to say.
And I think polling and testing, right? So if you're polling and testing all the time, that by the time you're ready to reopen, you're going to have an idea of what families are looking for versus what college students are looking for versus what someone 55 plus who may have a health condition may be interested in. Those types of things are very different. The goals of each group is very different. And so, again, from a data perspective, test, experiment.
And if you are hearing any resistance now, and we were talking about all of this earlier about, if there is a hesitation to go back into public spaces or whatever it is, making sure that you stress how they're going to feel safe at your organization, and considering flexibility. I mean, customer service, do you waive exchange fees for people at that time? I know that's a source of revenue for some institutions. What's the version of that is sustainable for your bottom line, that can make your customers feel that you are listening to what might be some uncertainty and some hesitation that they may be experiencing?
And one thing I would add too, I agree with everybody, of course. And one thing I would add is it's going to be a brave new world. We don't actually know what a media landscape is going to look like when we're talking to consumers in a really full-fledged way. I think digital is going to remain important because it's flexible, and we're going to be able to see where people are responding, whether it's they continue to be streaming or they're sick of their TVs and they want to go outside, so outdoor becomes important. So again, the point about being nimble comes up, and I think even down to like what contracts you're setting up with your media partners and your vendors. I would make sure that you have flexibility. If you're setting up an outdoor plan, make sure that you can get out of it if you can, or there's some sort of clause. But digital tends to always be, able to pause immediately. So digital is a very safe way to go, but I don't think it's going to be the only way to go moving forward. I think people are going to be excited to get outside. I think print circulations are probably up right now as well. So it'll be a continuous day-to-day looking at how the new media landscape is going to look in this new world.
In general, we know that media consumption was increasing in the past 3 to 5 years with a lot of smart tablets, smartphones, and desktops. And so I totally agree. Digital is very important. But I think that there's a love. I don't think humans realize how much they realize being around other humans, especially in New York. And so I think I truly do, because New Yorkers would go, oh, so many tourists and so on and so forth. But I think that being in the house for 3 months, like you said, you're not going to know if outdoor is all of a sudden going to become a really important thing where people might gather in Central Park just to see digital and be outside. You never know. So I agree. Flexibility is very important.
As we kind of head into the last couple of questions, I just want to make note for everybody that's watching. If you have any questions I haven't posed, please throw them in the chat or in the questions tab. As we kind of look at as institutions look at their planning moving forward, as they think about programming. One thing that I think we've talked about a lot today is sort of understanding who these new audiences are, the kind of things that they may respond to. And so my question becomes is how does one sort of utilize that data in planning, or is it sort of which comes first in the chicken or the egg? Does the programming come out of understanding who this new audience may be? Does finding these audiences come out of the programming that we want to do?
I'm looking at Ryan.
It's a good question. It is chicken and egg. Like we're collecting all this data, and how are you going to use it in the future? What messaging are you going to put out in the future? I'm going to repeat share actually and say test. Like, don't be afraid to go after that audience. And obviously a family audience requires a specific messaging versus a cultural audience. So test, A/B test, put out different things. Facebook has the feature now where you can actually, as you're building a campaign, you can tell it, I'm doing an A/B test right now. So it won't, Facebook tends to optimize towards what the best performing campaign is because they want to spend through your budget no matter what. But now you can actually make sure that your budget is equally going to campaigns, so you can truly see what's getting the better engagement, what's getting the better click-through rate, what people are responding to more positively.
As flexible as we try to be in the insights department and making sure that we ask questions we feel people want to know in a reasonable time, I also feel that it's important to test, but to feel free to test and to test a portion You know, you don't necessarily need to test the whole audience. If you're testing 10%, that's great. You don't need to necessarily go, oh, but now I'm going to reach my entire audience. Testing is just a portion so that it can give you an indication of where you need to go. And also, other things will prompt a question. So we may share some information, but it'll prompt the next question, as well as understanding the history of that particular client, and where they want to go, and what they've learned in the past 24 hours and feel like today's a new day that they'd like to learn more, right? So there's
Well said.
a combination of things there's a combination of things that I think go along with that.
Because there's a world in which you can overtest, right? Like you can't in one A/B test be testing what the copy is like and what the image is like and what the audience targeting is like. You need to have a control, and you need to have, one thing that you're testing, and then you can move on to, okay, now let's try the copy. Okay, now let's try an image test. But it's important not to over test.
Right. To everyone at the same time.
And there's fun ways to do it too, right? I saw a really good example. I forget which organization it was, but it was one of the Broadway presenters that said, if you could design your perfect Broadway season, what would it be? And so that's the form of testing, but it's actually giving you content and engaging with your base. So it makes them feel like they're part of the process, and you're not being silent right now, and you're gathering useful information that you can house on Instagram, which is where I saw it. And maybe you do that on your email list, or you don't. If you get the responses that you like and you can glean some information from Instagram, great.
Right. And you can constantly build on your answers. So it doesn't mean you have to send a 30-question survey. It could mean 3 questions, and then continue to build and continue to segment.
Sort of following up on that, talking about the testing, because I know that one of the advantages of social media marketing and using a lot of the tools that Facebook in particular has is that it is very easy to test there, and it is also relatively very cheap to run some of those tests. So then my question becomes, how do you take the result of those tests and kind of branch that out into the rest of your marketing and utilize that test information?
I think it depends on what you're testing. Like family audience versus a cultural audience. That seems to be the example we keep using. It really depends on what you're testing, whether it's what creative is more effective to those audiences. I mean, the beauty of most people are running Facebook in-house. So the beauty of testing through a platform like Facebook is that you can get results really quick, and then you can optimize really quick. So if you see that something is performing outstandingly more well than another campaign, you can shift the budget into that campaign and see if it helps even boost performance further. So that is, again, one of the benefits of Facebook, is that it's such a fast-moving platform. And even while we're short-staffed right now, if you're passionate about it, you can get in there and change audiences really quickly.
I also think that you may want to consider that each platform may be optimized in different ways. And so you may have an audience that still does digital, but there's still a robust 65 plus audience that is using more digital, but still may not use as much. And so if you test in digital, I would hope that the idea also is to go, wow, we found this result in digital. Let's see and test in another area as well.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Like if you've discovered that you can tap into a demographic that you didn't know that you could tap into, then you can apply that to how you're targeting your outdoor, how you're targeting your TV.
Right.
It's a really good point.
There was a Google presentation a couple years ago about a case study that The Greatest Showman did about the storytelling and what people were responding to in creative content about the trailer. So again, presenting organizations, there's probably some version of this that pertains with you, but go with me on this journey. Everybody was served an ad that was the Hugh Jackman storyline. And if people engaged with it and watched it through a certain point, they were then served the next step in a 3-part process that was about Hugh Jackman. And then the final, I believe, was, I think, the film trailer. If people stopped watching at a certain point, those people were then given the Zac Efron storyline. And if they engaged with it to a certain degree, they were then given the trailer, or if they stopped, they just stopped talking to those people because you could go, you didn't need to talk to them necessarily, or you were going to hit them some other way. So if you have the resources to test something, and what that means to different people, it remains to be determined. If you can figure out how to do that, it is, to your point, relatively inexpensive, and you can really use that, to what everybody was saying, inform other elements of your campaign offline based on the responses you see.
And Google, which is the YouTube platform, is like Facebook, relatively simple to set that stuff up. I mean, your example with the sequenced messaging and videos, it's really a button that you push on YouTube, and then you can upload the video path that you want people to go on. So it sounds daunting, but these are relatively simple things to achieve.
Great. So my final question that I've stolen from one of my favorite podcasters is to pose the question of, what should I have asked you about that I didn't?
What's my favorite Broadway show?
Ooh, that's a great question. What is it?
It is Pippin, actually. My favorite Broadway show of all time is Pippin.
Wow. I love so many shows. I can't say that I actually have a favorite at this point. It would be like telling, your boyfriend how much you loved your first love, or I can't do it. So I'm going to bow out gracefully from that question. Robert?
I too love many shows, but I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to say a chorus line. I'm going to stick to that.
Okay, so I will tell you
here it is.
Yeah, I'm going to give my first boyfriend, because usually people don't get offended if you talk about your first boyfriend. West Side Story.
But you meant about data, right?
Yeah. Not that this whole conversation hasn't made me really miss being able to sit down in a Broadway theater, but that final question certainly did. But eventually we'll all get
we'll be together soon.
That's right. I want to thank all three of you so much for joining us this week, and to everybody watching. And thank you for putting up with some of the technical snafus that we ran into. But we'll continue endeavoring on in this socially distant and digital world, and until we can all meet again in a Broadway house. So those of you that are along for the ride with us on this Industry Pro journey, we'll be back next week with a roundtable discussion. So check your email for information about that and some further webinars down the road. We've been putting together the calendar, and it's a lot of very exciting conversations coming up. A lot like this very exciting conversation. So once again, thank you all for watching, and you three for being here. And we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.